stocky enforcer in a worn blue jacket just did the unthinkable. He backhanded a frail, 78-year-old widow, sending her reeling against the diner booth. Maurice Holloway, dressed in her modest wool cardigan, clutched the table, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Around her, the Silver Pine local diner went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Nobody moved. They were paralyzed, not by lack of care, but by the sheer, cold fear of the man standing over her. Cade Jennings let out a dry, jagged laugh, looking around the room as if he were a king surveying a conquered territory. He believed his power in this town was absolute, that a badge or a bank account gave him the right to crush anyone in his way. But as he loomed over Maurice, demanding she sign away her life's sanctuary, Cade made a fatal miscalculation. He saw a helpless, elderly woman. He didn't see the shadow moving across the front window. He had no idea her son was Delta Force, and that Marcus Holloway, and 100 pounds of trained military muscle on a leash, were about to kick that door off its hinges. Before we reveal the moment the predator becomes the prey, let us know in the comments. What would you do if you saw justice being served in your own town? And if you believe that those who protect the vulnerable deserve our respect, hit that subscribe button to join our community. High above the chaos of the diner, the air over Silver Pine Lake remained indifferent and majestic. It was a crisp October morning, where the Colorado sky stretched out in a piercing, endless blue. The surrounding peaks were draped in a vibrant cloak of russet orange and deep gold, the aspen trees shivering in the light mountain breeze. A thin layer of ice still clung to the shoreline, shimmering like crushed glass under the rising sun. It was a place of profound peace, a peace that Maurice Holloway had moved here to find, and a peace that was about to be defended with tactical precision. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the diner's ceiling fan was the only sound that dared to fill the silence as Cade Jennings leaned over Maurice's table. He was a man who carried his malice like a physical weight, his presence punctuated by the smell of stale tobacco and the rough, abrasive texture of his worn blue jacket. To the locals of Silver Pine, that jacket was a uniform of intimidation, a sign that the muscle for the town's corrupt elite was on the clock. Cade didn't just sit, he loomed, his thick fingers drumming a slow, menacing beat against the laminate tabletop, right next to Mari's untouched cup of tea. He didn't see a woman with a lifetime of resilience. He saw an aging obstacle that needed to be cleared for a high-end resort. "You're a long way from the city, Mrs. Holloway," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that felt like sandpaper. He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a crumpled architectural rendering of the Silver Pine development project, smoothing it out over her placemat with a sneer. "This lake is changing. Progress is coming, whether you're ready or not. People like Sterling Croft don't like waiting, and I don't like coming out here twice." He leaned closer, his shadow swallowing the light from the window, invading the small circle of safety Maurice had tried to maintain. The warning was more than verbal. It was a cold, calculated display of dominance designed to make her feel small, isolated, and utterly disposable. Maurice met his gaze, her hands steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She saw the cruelty in his eyes, the absolute certainty of a man who believed that might always made right. Cade tapped the paper once more, his knuckles white. "Sign the papers, sell the house, and take the check. Or keep playing the martyr and see how quickly this peaceful little sanctuary becomes a very dangerous place for a woman your age." He stood up, the chair screeching against the linoleum like a dying animal, leaving the threat hanging in the air as thick as wood smoke. He believed he had broken her spirit with a single look, unaware that the foundation he was trying to crack was reinforced by the strength of a son who specialized in dismantling men exactly like him. The midday rush at the Silver Pine Diner usually buzzed with the comforting clink of ceramic mugs and local gossip, but today, the air was thick with a suffocating, unnatural stillness. Maurice Holloway sat in her usual corner booth, her small frame appearing even more delicate against the worn red vinyl. Across from her, Cade Jennings' patience had finally evaporated. His face, once smug, was now a mask of jagged, unrestrained fury. He didn't care about the witnesses. In this town, the witnesses were his subjects, and their silence was his crown. When Maurice softly repeated her refusal to sign the development papers, her voice steady despite her pale features, Cade snapped. The sound of the slap was a sharp, sickening crack that echoed like a gunshot against the diner's wood-paneled walls. The force of the blow was enough to send Mari's reeling, her head snapping to the side as she slumped against the window, her glasses skittering across the floor. For a heartbeat, time seemed to liquefy. A young waitress gasped, her tray trembling in her hands, but she didn't move. A group of local contractors lowered their heads, suddenly fascinated by their coffee. It was a collective moment of profound cowardice. A room full of people watched a defenseless widow be struck by a man twice her size, and they chose the safety of their silence over the necessity of justice. Cade didn't look ashamed, he looked invigorated. He leaned over the table, his shadow stretching over Mari's crumpled form like a predator over its kill. "I told you, old woman," he hissed, his voice dripping with a terrifying, casual cruelty. "Nobody is coming to help you. In Silverpine, I am the law." He reached down to grab her arm, intent on dragging her from the booth to finish his intimidation in the alleyway. The diner patrons turned away, their faces etched with a shame they would carry for years. They believed the story ended there, with the triumph of a bully and the breaking of a spirit. They were so focused on the floor and their plates that they didn't hear the low, rhythmic thrum of a heavy diesel engine idling just outside the door, or the metallic click of a tactical lead being unclipped. The silence following the slap was not broken by a scream, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a tactical boot meeting the diner's floorboards. The front door hadn't just opened, it had been commanded aside. Marcus Halloway stepped into the dim light of the diner, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the room. He was a vision of lethal discipline, clad in the scorched earth patterns of a Delta Force operator, his gear humming with the quiet vibration of a man who lived in the world's most dangerous shadows. Beside him, his military K9, a Belgian Malinois with eyes like amber glass, moved in a perfect, haunting heel. The dog didn't growl. It simply fixed its gaze on Cade Jennings with a predatory stillness that suggested it was merely waiting for the word to dismantle him. Marcus's eyes didn't waste time on the stunned crowd or the trembling waitress. They locked onto the sight of his mother, Mari's, pulling herself up from the vinyl booth, her hand pressed against a cheek that was already beginning to bloom into a dark, angry purple. In that moment, the quiet storm broke. There was no shouting, no cinematic roar of rage. Instead, there was something far more terrifying, a cold, surgical focus. Marcus moved toward the table with the steady, unstoppable gait of an incoming tide. Every person in that diner, including the contractors who had looked away moments before, felt the sudden, crushing weight of a true Tier 1 operator's authority. Cade Jennings, still standing over Mari's with his hand raised, froze. The bravado that had served him so well against elderly women and terrified locals evaporated, replaced by the primal realization that he was no longer the apex predator in the room. He looked at the dog, then at the man in the multicam uniform, and finally at the frail widow he had just struck. He had expected a victim. He had found a reckoning. Marcus reached his mother's side, his gloved hand resting gently on her shoulder, while his other hand remained a hair's breadth from his side, a silent promise that the town of Silverpine was under new management. The heavy silence of the diner was broken not by a voice, but by the subtle, electronic chime of a successful upload. In a far booth, Liam Webb, a young travel vlogger who had been documenting his cross-country trip, lowered his smartphone with trembling hands. His camera had captured everything: the predatory lean of Cade Jennings, the sickening crack of the slap, and the tectonic arrival of the Delta Force operator. Even as Marcus stood as a silent sentry over his mother, the digital world was already reacting. Within minutes, the boundaries of Silverpine Lake had dissolved, and the town's untouchable hierarchy was being scrutinized by millions of eyes across the globe. The video acted as a digital wildfire, bypassing the corrupt local channels that had kept the town suppressed for years. People from neighboring counties and distant states began tagging federal agencies and national news outlets, creating a groundswell of outrage that the local sheriff could not arrest or intimidate. The comments section became a living record of the town's hidden history, as other residents, emboldened by the footage, began to post their own stories of Cade's harassment and the mayor's land-grabbing schemes. The social media justice was swift and unforgiving. The diner, once a place of quiet cowardice, had become the epicenter of a national scandal. Marcus noticed the glow of the screens around the room. He didn't need to see the footage to know the mission had changed. He wasn't just defending a home anymore. He was the face of a reckoning that could no longer be buried. While Cade snarled at the onlookers to put their phones away, the damage was irreversible. The evidence was no longer just a memory in a traumatized room. It was an immutable record stored on 1,000 servers. The high-definition reality of Mari's, Holloway's dignity, and Cade's cruelty had stripped the villains of their most powerful weapon, the darkness they operated in. While the digital world burned with outrage, the architect of Silver Pine's misery sat in a mahogany-lined office 3 blocks away. Mayor Sterling Croft did not look like a man who dealt in violence. He looked like a man who dealt in progress. But on his desk lay the physical heartbeat of the town's corruption. A small, leather-bound ledger that held the names of every family whose life had been dismantled to make way for the luxury resort. This was the corruption web, a meticulously documented map of illegal land seizures, laundered developer funds, and kickbacks to a local sheriff who had long ago traded his badge for a paycheck. Croft believed that as long as this book remained in his possession, the truth was a ghost he could easily exorcise. The ledger was a chilling record of calculated greed. It showed exactly how much Cade Jennings was paid to encourage residents like Mari's to sell, and the exact dates when the local utility companies were instructed to cut service to those who resisted. Croft had spent years spinning this web, ensuring that every thread led back to him while remaining invisible to the public eye. He viewed the townspeople not as neighbors, but as obstacles on a balance sheet. To him, Mari's Holloway was simply line item 42, a stubborn variable that needed to be zeroed out. He poured a glass of expensive bourbon, unaware that the viral video from the diner had already alerted federal auditors to the financial anomalies in Silver Pine's accounts. The mayor's confidence was a house of cards. He assumed the soldier at the diner was just a grieving son acting on impulse. He didn't realize that Marcus Holloway wasn't just a soldier. He was a specialist in unconventional warfare who understood that to kill a snake, you don't just step on its tail, you destroy its nest. As Croft reached for his pen to sign another seizure order, the ledger's contents were already being cross-referenced by military intelligence. The web was no longer a trap for the residents of Silver Pine. It was becoming a noose for the man who had spun it. The shift from defense to offense was as silent and precise as a midnight drop into hostile territory. Marcus Holloway knew that the diner assault was merely a symptom of a deeper rot, and as a Delta Force operator, he understood that winning the room was useless if you didn't win the war. Leaving his mother in the secure care of the few townspeople whose courage had finally thawed, Marcus transitioned into a state of tactical retribution. He didn't storm the town hall with sirens. He moved through the shadows of Silver Pine with the practiced invisibility of a ghost. Using encrypted comms and the specialized surveillance tools of his trade, he began to intercept the frantic, panicked communications between Cade Jennings and the mayor's office. The evidence he sought wasn't just digital, it was physical. Marcus knew that men like Croft always kept a black book, a fail-safe that served as both a map of their crimes and insurance against their partners. Under the cover of a moonless Colorado sky, Marcus bypassed the rudimentary security of the development office. Shadow, his K-9 partner, worked with him in a seamless, nonverbal dance, scenting for human presence while Marcus cloned hard drives and photographed the paper trail of the Silver Pine development project. This wasn't a revenge mission. It was a surgical extraction of the truth. He moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency that the local sheriff, currently drinking in a nearby bar, couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the peaks, Marcus had secured enough evidence to trigger a federal emergency response. He had captured the digital handshake between the developers and the offshore accounts, the recorded threats against local families, and the coordinates of every illegal land grab. The retribution was not found in a fistfight, but in the overwhelming weight of the truth he had just digitized. As he slipped back into the woods, the trap he had laid for the mayor was already beginning to close. The elite soldier had turned the entire town into a kill box for corruption, and the villains were still sleeping, unaware that their world had already been dismantled. The heavy, humid air inside the Silverpine Sheriff's Department smelled of stale coffee and the metallic tang of old radiator steam. Sheriff Miller Kent sat behind a desk cluttered with blue jacket payoffs, staring at a static-filled monitor that played a loop of the diner assault. He was a man caught between two worlds, the oath he had taken 20 years ago and the lucrative, corrupt loyalty he had sold to Mayor Croft. Outside, he could see the silhouette of a military-grade vehicle idling at the curb, a silent sentinel that made his hand tremble as he reached for his service weapon. For the first time in a decade, the sheriff felt the crushing weight of the law, not as a tool he controlled, but as a hammer poised to fall. Marcus Holloway didn't wait to be buzzed in. He entered the station with the quiet, terrifying gravity of a man who already knew every secret hidden in the file cabinets. Shadow, the K-9, remained at the door, its amber eyes fixed on the deputy behind the front desk, pinning him in place without a single growl. Marcus walked straight to Kent's desk and placed a small, encrypted drive on top of the stack of bribes. "You have exactly 5 minutes to decide, Sheriff," Marcus said, his voice a low, clinical rasp. "You can be the man who helps me secure the mayor's ledger, or you can be the first person the FBI processes when they breach this zip code. Loyalty to a thief or the law you swore to uphold, make your choice." The sheriff looked at the drive, then up at the elite operator whose mother he had allowed to be terrorized. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the ticking of a wall clock that sounded like a countdown. Kent realized that the untouchable world Croft had built was a phantom. It had vanished the moment that slap echoed through the diner. With a shaking hand, the sheriff reached for the drive and his keys. He chose the law, not out of sudden virtue, but out of a primal fear of the storm Marcus Holloway had brought to his doorstep. The betrayal of the mayor had begun, and the web of corruption was finally tearing at the seams. Idea for attaching the PDF. You should attach the PDF as a sheriff's confessional and evidence log. Design the document to look like a transcribed interrogation or a voluntary deposition, with the Silverpine County Sheriff's Department seal at the top. This gives the reader the feeling that they are reading the formal turning point, where the local power structure finally collapsed under the weight of Marcus's intervention. The stillness of the Silverpine morning was shattered not by the wind, but by the synchronized roar of blacked-out SUVs and the rhythmic thrum of federal rotors overhead. Marcus Holloway stood on the steps of the town hall, his mission transitioning from a solitary shadow to the spearhead of a federal raid. As the FBI and NCIS tactical teams breached the perimeter, the fall of the triumvirate was as swift as it was absolute. Mayor Croft was caught in the act of shredding the very documents Marcus had already cloned, his hands trembling as the cold steel of handcuffs replaced his gold fountain pen. The high-definition evidence Marcus had secured during the night had left no room for legal maneuvering or local interference. The web had been cut. Across town, at the Silverpine Development Project headquarters, Cade Jennings attempted to flee through a back exit, only to be pinned by the laser-focused gaze of the Delta Force K-9. Shadow didn't need to strike. The dog's low, vibrating growl was a physical wall that Cade dared not cross. The stocky enforcer, who had so casually slapped a widow the day before, now looked like a cornered animal, his blue jacket stripped of its power. Simultaneously, federal agents moved into the sheriff's department, where Miller Kent sat waiting, his badge already placed on the desk in an act of surrender. The triad of corruption, the money, the muscle, and the law collapsed under the weight of a coordinated strike that felt more like a military operation than a standard arrest. As the sun climbed higher, the residents of Silverpine gathered in the streets, watching in stunned silence as the men who had terrorized them were led away. The air, once thick with the suffocating pressure of Croft's greed, suddenly felt light again. Marcus walked through the chaos, his focus entirely on his mother, Mary's, who stood at the edge of the crowd. He didn't need a victory lap. The mission wasn't about the arrests, it was about the restoration of the sanctuary. The triumvirate had fallen, and for the first time in years, the only thing rising over Silverpine Lake was the promise of justice. The following week, the air over Silverpine Lake was free of the suffocating tension that had defined it for years. The heavy machinery of the developers sat silent, impounded by federal order, and the aggressive roar of Cade Jennings' truck was replaced by the gentle, rhythmic lap of the water against the shore. Maurice Halloway sat on her porch, no longer clutching a mug for warmth against a cold world, but holding it with the steady hand of a woman who had seen the storm and survived it. Beside her sat Marcus, stripped of his tactical gear, but retaining that same quiet, formidable presence. The new dawn was more than just the sun rising over the Colorado peaks. It was the rebirth of a town that had finally remembered how to stand on its own. The transformation in Maurice was the most profound. She still wore her modest cardigans and spoke with a soft, melodic voice, but the silk of her outward gentleness no longer hid her strength. It emphasized it. She had become the heart of the community's recovery, organizing meetings for the families whose land had been targeted, and ensuring that the federal investigators had every detail they needed to secure a permanent peace. The townspeople no longer saw her as a frail widow to be pitied or protected. They saw her as the steel beneath the silk, the anchor that had held firm when the town's foundation was rotting. Even Cade Jennings, awaiting sentencing, had sent a letter of formal apology, his spirit finally broken by the unwavering dignity of the woman he had tried to crush. As evening fell, the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, reflected in the mirror-still surface of the lake. Marcus looked at his mother, seeing not the victim of a diner assault, but the woman whose resilience had forged his own. The mission was complete. The sanctuary at Silverpine Lake was once again a place of rest, not a battleground. They sat in a comfortable, hard-won silence, knowing that while the scars of the past week would remain, they were now marks of a victory that would protect the lake for generations to come. If this story of justice and unwavering courage moved you, please share it with someone who needs to remember that truth always prevails. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the protectors among us and honor those who stand firm against darkness. Comment below. Which moment resonated most with you? The courage to stand alone, the power of evidence, or the community that finally found its voice? If you believe that righteousness will always triumph over corruption, write Amen in the comments. God bless you all.